Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of FiST Chat, the vodcast that covers topics related to film, science and technology. My name's Ben Warner and I'm joined by Stephen Kern. How you doing there, Steve?
Good mate, good. Hello to everyone out there in FiST Chat land.
And you are all ready to get chatting about, we're talking about Apple again, funny enough.
Oh, good. Bring it on mate, bring it on.
So just to, I guess, introduce the topic of what we're talking about here is this is actually the second episode we're recording for today, and the reason why we're doing this one is our story has just come up in the recent weeks in relation to subscription models that Apple are putting in place for content developers, and also the flow-on effect of how it affects consumers. And I guess it follows on from the topic where we discussed about Murdoch's paywall and how he wanted to introduce a system of charging for content. Now, Apple's got their system in place, and it actually has been in place for quite some time, but what really kicked the whole thing off was Sony developed an e-reader app for the iPhone and iPad, and it was rejected by Apple for breaching their guidelines and terms and conditions for apps. And the reason behind it, at least according to them, was that it was providing external links to content outside of the app, and it didn't provide the option of buying within the app. But of course, if you buy within the app, as you know, if all content developers are required to pay 30% of all revenue that they earn through Apple's subscription model service. So this has kicked off a very big kind of debate, and the competition is now starting to heat up, especially now Google has announced their own system where they're only going to charge 10%, but they're going to leave the options open for content developers so that they don't feel as locked in as far as what Apple's doing. So any initial thoughts on that, Steve?
Oh, where do I start? Well, what a lovely bunch of guys from Google are. They reckon at 10% they're not going to make any money. You know, who believes that?
And they actually, and they've actually said that, yeah.
They have actually said that they're not going to make any money. No, of course not. Just getting back to the Apple thing. You know, it would be easy, and a lot of people over the whole iTunes and the Flash debate, and a lot of the things where Apple has collided with the rest of the world since they became quite a lot more, I guess, accessible to the general public, stems from the fact that Apple actually haven't really changed their business plan since 1976. They've been making their own computers, they've been making their own software, and really until they went with the Intel chips, they were their own unit, as their own unit as an iPod is today or an iPad is today. So from their perspective, they've always been running this line. And, you know, once upon a time when no one really wanted to get on board with Apple except the original fanboys, okay, that was fine. You know, you were just a little bit quirky or weird or gay for having an Apple, you know. But today, everyone wants to, to have Apple, but everyone wants to have Google and Flash at the same time. You know, what are we to say? Should Steve Jobs sit down and stick with hardware and let software go open source? That just wouldn't be Apple.
All right, before I make the next point, so basically what you're saying there is that they're still using the same sort of model that they've always been...
Always have.
Okay. That's very interesting for me, because Apple is a company, out of all the technology companies, that you could really call an innovator. You know, they set the agenda, okay? They come out with something and then everyone else either copies it or tries to do something that's similar to it.
Absolutely.
Which makes this very fascinating that they can't seem to innovate on something like this, where there's a subscription model.
Well, I'll just jump in and say this, Ben. Getting back to how it was before Apple went to Intel. Okay, they had their own processors. Everything was like, they had the Motorola processors. That was Apple. And back then, everyone was using open source pirated software on their Windows platform. And the reason that people never bought Apple was because, there was only 5% of the software or something like that, and you couldn't pirate it anyway. That's what people used to say. So Apple have maintained exactly the same ethos now that they're on a multi-platform arena, and people don't like it.
Yeah, I think, moving along as far, I have a bit of an issue with it in that I am, in essence, a content developer. So looking at the way they lock things in, I'm not, maybe that would have been different if they were a distribution channel all on their own. But they're not, because now we have the internet. I agree. They may be able to generate sales, fair enough, because they've got a curated app store. They've got iTunes as a curated music and movie store. So people know that it's like brand recognition. People know that, so they'll go there to find their content. So in a sense, there's an advantage in that. But the problem is that the internet is a different kettle of fish to the old models in that. And we've had chats about this off the record, of course, as well, about the fact that under old models of subscription, or even if you're just trying to sell anything, it's what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the pie, the whole pie. Whereas the internet, making money off the internet is a different thing in that all you really need to do is get pieces of the pie. And people, I know this is going to sound odd, but people can share those pieces of pies. They can move them around and all that sort of thing. And
nobody shares pieces of pie, mate.
I realise that, but the thing is, the nature of the internet is going to make that happen.
Oh, look,
it doesn't matter how much these corporations kick up a stink and try and nail down, their flag on this bit of subscription or this bit of revenue. They're always going to come up with the fact that somebody else somewhere can establish themselves somewhere else and become bigger than them, or as big as them, and compete. And an excellent example of this is Microsoft and Google. Now, Microsoft was the dominant software developer for the, late 80s and the 90s, arguably. They dominate the computer market. Then what happens now, Google started only in, I think it was 98 or 99, and within 5-6 years, they became a huge corporation, and now they are bigger than Microsoft. And the reason for that is that they've adapted to this new forum of the internet. Now, there's been also some arguments to say that Google's not really innovating as much as what they used to, because really the predominant source of their revenue is search-based advertising. But it just goes to serve the point. Should Apple be thinking about not necessarily changing that particular aspect, but offering different sort of subscription models and adapting to these new environments?
Well, I think you've made an excellent point there, with the Microsoft one. When all computing was closed source, pre-internet, Microsoft was dominant. There was a time when they tried to take over the internet with MSN, and let's see where they got then. Not very far.
But didn't Bill Gates refuse to admit that the internet was going to amount to anything as well?
It was something like that. Very embarrassing for him. And just like Microsoft, I think if you go back to the original iPod, when the iPod was still closed, there was no iTunes store, you can see Apple's business model there. It's closed. It's Apple. You've got to be Apple to use the iPod. Now, like you say, with the internet and open source, Apple are actually using a model that's outdated, and I agree with you. I think they really need to have a big rethink. And what they've done effectively by going in and charging a ridiculous rate of 30% is allow Google to come in at 10% and say that they're not going to make any money, which is unbelievable. And I do want to ask you this thing, because this is a very, very interesting point. I mean, Google was all open source, or so they tell us, and they created Android open source, but are they really open source? And if they ever get a decent competitor, which I think it'll still be maybe five years away before Google is seriously challenged. Yeah. Where will the threat there? Because Google will definitely, if it wasn't for the likes of the old timers like Sony and Apple, I'd almost be wondering whether you couldn't accuse Google right now of being almost antitrust.
Well, that's probably a fair point. I mean, you know, they're all in it for their own self-interest and whatever, and obviously, you know, Google with their "don't be evil" mantra is trying to like do the altruistic, you know, try to take the altruistic path, and obviously that isn't there. But I think you look at all of these things, and at the moment you would think that Google, I think, has sort of sniffed the wind, so to speak, and I think they've basically caught Apple out on this one. The main issue, of course, is that if you look at, say, specifically the iTunes store, they bumped heads against Sony, and now Sony, who obviously not a small little company, have decided that, well, if you're going to reject us for that, then we're going to pull out all our content from the iTunes store. And just see what happens to Apple then if that comes off. The talk, of course, now is that Apple at some point is going to rejig their terms and conditions, and but what they'll do is they'll probably say something like, "Oh, you know, we always meant it to be like this, but we've just adjusted it a little bit so that it's a little bit more clear as to what's happening." And they really have to, because another excellent example of an app that's in trouble is the Amazon Kindle app, which you can actually, obviously that's for the Kindle, which is an e-reader, but Amazon actually develops apps for all platforms across the board. So it doesn't matter if you've got a PC, Mac, iPhone, you know, Android phone, whatever, iPad. There's an app for it from Amazon. You can sync all your content with it, and it doesn't matter which app you have. As soon as you pick it up, you can sync it and you'll have all your content. Now, that to me is a model for the internet that will work, and Apple doesn't have that in place. And currently, under the terms and conditions that Apple has in place, where they rejected the Sony app, the Amazon Kindle app is also in trouble, because basically what they do is to download books for it, you actually have to redirect via a link to their website to buy the book. And under the terms and conditions that Apple's sort of starting to enforce now, I'm not sure why they didn't wrap Amazon Kindle over this particular thing. That it was, for some reason, Sony, they wrapped the knuckles over it. That means that Amazon's going to have to do that as well. What's going to happen now? Is Amazon going to say, "Oh, sorry, we're not going to do that, so we're not going to offer any content through"? You can see how this kind of snowballs for Apple.
Yeah, well, what I'm interested in, Ben, and you might be able to answer this, is just very quickly is, okay, you've got Murdoch and News Corp who tried the paywall, but they're external to the internet. They gather news in the real world and try to put it online.
Yeah.
You've got Apple, that despite the fact they do a lot of internet stuff, they're really a hardware company.
Yeah.
Okay, they're trying to deal in content. But you've got Google, which doesn't do any hardware. In fact, Google's nothing except an apparition on our screens. The only competitor I can see who could successfully take on Google now is Microsoft. Can Microsoft make a comeback?
Oh, that's hard to tell. They're not being a company that traditionally you would call an innovator, because although they're a dominator, which means that
they did that very well too.
They know how to be the dominating player in the market, but they don't lead the market. They basically watch someone else innovate, and they either buy it out or they copy it in some way. So maybe there's another player that's going to emerge, like you said, maybe in the next 5-6 years. And it can happen that quickly, because Google came up that quickly as well. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the future holds in that regard. Okay, so running out of time very quickly. So, thanks again, Steve. I'm sure we can revisit this one again, because I'm sure it's not going to go away. Maybe when we find out what happens. And that's it for this episode. The next episode,
see everyone.
We'll let you know in due course. And until then, we'll catch you then.